a second Yu-Gi-Oh format has a plane has hit the second Yu-Gi-Oh format has been hit. This is a video about Genesys format. Okay, so I literally woke up to the news about Genesys format like today. So I didn't have time to write a full script, but I did want to talk about it. So I wrote down some bullet points on my phone, and we're just gonna go down it like a real YouTuber. So what? Okay, before I even start talking, what is Genesys format? Genesys format is a second format that Konami TCG, Konami of America, is sanctioning. The conceit of the format seems to be get lapsed players back into the game. People like me who like Yu-Gi-Oh! But have trouble with how complex it's gotten, can't find people to play with, or are priced out of the format. That's something they actually talked about specifically in one of their blog posts, which I'll talk about in a second, is they are concerned about, it seems that Konami TCG is concerned about the price of certain engines or certain extra deck payoffs specifically. So how does the format work? Number one, there are no Link or Pendulum monsters. These are the two extra deck / summoning mechanics that people seem to have the most problems with, especially older players. There are people who don't like synchros, who don't like Xyz monsters, but those mechanics are easy enough to grasp how do they work in the context of the game, or are easy to ignore thanks to certain decks like Gem Knight or Hero or Branded or whatever ritual slop you want to play. But even ritual slop and all those fusion archetypes have room in their extra deck for Link monsters specifically. And Pendulum is just a design space that neither players nor Konami seems to really like. It seems like every time they design a new Pendulum card, it's either one card in the archetype. It's incredibly xenophobic, which means you can't mix it with other Pendulum cards or other archetypes, or it just gets added to the big Pendulum, Odd Eyes, Magician, Perform of Pal, slop pile. So I totally understand getting rid of those two summoning mechanics specifically. I do think it's funny that Link monsters have become so ubiquitous with the game. Just so many cards are generic Link monsters that even in lower powered formats, like if you watch Master Saga, you've probably seen like Geonator Transverser come up, or I was looking the other day at like Haggard Lizardoise or Dispatcherazzi. Like all these cards are easy enough to get your hands on and are generic enough that they go in any extra deck. So I'm very curious to see what extra decks are going to look like for this format specifically. There's also no ban list, which means any card that's been printed since Yu-Gi-Oh's beginning that aren't Pendulum or Link monsters can be played in your deck. The way they're going to get around this is through a point system that seems to be, according to Joshua Schmidt's video, it's going to be updated every month or two, which is a lot more often update than Konami's ban list updates, which I appreciate that there's sort of a slower update so that we can let the format breathe, and then a bigger update for when when new sets come out. That seems like that would be my use of the point system, is every time a new set comes out, you give it maybe a week or two, and then you update the point system based on what was in the set, especially because of how often Yu-Gi-Oh sets come out now. So the list of cards with points is available on the Genesys website, and I'll try and link that down below. Yeah, those seem to be the big like points of the format. They said in the blog that for official tournaments, the point cap for decks is going to be around 100, but OTS stores and tournaments and all these other things are allowed to raise it as high or as low as they'd like. So if you want to have a 500-point Genesys event, you can, and if you want to have a 50-point Genesys event, you can. And I think that's really interesting too, giving OTS stores the freedom to decide the power level of their own format, which I'll talk about in a minute. But that's really good. It's sort of I think it's Rivalry of Warlords, that's the format that does that. Or no, Heart of the Underdog. It's sort of like Heart of the Underdog in that way. Okay, on to my bullet points. I have 14 things I want to talk about. Some of these things are longer than others. Number one, Trinity format already did this. They already made a point system. I've never played Trinity. I don't know how it plays. I don't know what's good or whatever, but I'm aware of it just being kind of in the Yu-Gi-Oh space. It's a fan format where you can only summon 3 times, and cards have a point system. That format seems to be That format has their own very specific goals as a fan format, which is their right. They created the format. They get to decide what they want. But Genesys seems to have different goals. I will also mention, or also say, like, having a second Konami sanctioned format is way easier than just telling people to play a fan format. Yu-Gi-Oh players don't have the same bug in their brain as Magic players, where they like to play whatever new format comes up. Yu-Gi-Oh players just like to play Yu-Gi-Oh, and whatever is officially sanctioned, Yu-Gi-Oh. Um, and that means basically playing whatever Konami sanctions at events. Yu-Gi-Oh players just like accolades. They just like winning, and I can't harp on them too much for that. But when they sanctioned all those casual formats in 2020, none of those really caught on except for Time Wizard, which they've since killed. Just because it's kind of hard to convince people to play like an alternate form of Yu-Gi-Oh, especially if it's not going to be played at tournaments. So telling people to play a fan format is kind of difficult. It's the same problem that I'm sure Domain format has. All these other fan formats that you've probably never heard of. But this seems like a Konami-sanctioned version of Trinity, if that makes sense. And I'd love to see them do a Konami-sanctioned send-up of Domain format. Maybe don't copy those rules exactly. But yeah, I'd love to see what they could come up with that. Number 2, get Yu-Gi boomers back. I don't want to say that Yu-Gi-Oh has been bleeding players, but I will say it's been really hard to get players into the Yu-Gi-Oh space, to get new people into the Yu-Gi-Oh space. And a lot of this is due to card complexity. The base rules for Yu-Gi-Oh are relatively simple. You get one summon per turn. Monsters require sacrifice depending on depending on what their level is. You can play as many spell and trap cards as you want per turn, blah, 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 blah. All those basic rules that are like represented in the anime are pretty easy to understand. But when you start adding so much text on a card, and then you introduce all these different mechanics, fusions, rituals, synchros, exes, links, pendulums, Gemini, so on and so forth, the game becomes incredibly complex. So by taking out these card types that Yu-Gi boomers don't really like pendulums and exes, the game becomes a lot more appealing to them. I'll say that much. Like, how often did we make the joke in like 2017 of like Yu-Gi boomers getting in a dueling book room and saying, no pendulum, no exes, no meta, like blah, blah, blah. This kind of fixes that problem, right? The point system is genius. This is a great way to get players who like specific cards, Pot of Greed, to play the game without breaking the entire format. That's sort of the problem with not problem, but the limitations of the Forbidden list, right? Is once a card is unforbidden, that card is unforbidden for every deck. But by having a point system, you can curve the power level of specific decks so that the meta decks or the good decks are more expensive to play with all of their in-engine stuff, so that all that out-of-engine stuff, like hand traps, like equalizers, and generic extra deck tools, I think those are the big three, become available to the lower power decks. So Tenpai is going to have a different 100-point list than something like Dragon Maid. For Speed Duels was a bad second format. Speed Duel was a really good board game, in my experience. Those boxes made for really fun gameplay, but those packs made for really bad constructed formats. And I also think it was kind of frustrating that players couldn't just play with the cards that they already had. You need the specific Speed Duel stamp. A lot of the cards were just kind of anime fluff, and if you didn't really like Duel Monsters or GX, you were kind of screwed. And the cards didn't really feel all that powerful to play, especially without a skill card. I summoned Dark Magician for the 12th time. Dark Magician doesn't really do anything. It's a lot more fun to play cards that do stuff, right? And so I think having this second format where the more casual decks become more powerful or become just more playable is a lot better than just having like vanilla slop for forever and ever. I know Speed Duel eventually became not that, but that's how it was marketed towards people. So take that as you will. 5, this lets us print more legacy support that matters. Yu-Gi-Oh releases 4-ish 100 card core sets every year, along with supplementary products in between. And a lot of the time, the point of those core sets are to inject new decks into the format, but sometimes they'll print legacy support for older decks into the format as well. The problem is, a lot of the time, this legacy support doesn't do anything to boost the power level of those decks in any meaningful capacity that you can play that deck at an official event and do well. There are exceptions like the Blue Eye structure, the new Gem Knight cards seem really good, but for the most part, like the Ice Barrier structure deck didn't do anything to make Ice Barrier playable, right? But Konami can't stop printing legacy support because there are people who love those pet decks, and that fills up the set list of 100 cards, right? So this means that we can print new cards that support old archetypes that will have a place in the game, that matter, like the new Six Samurai cards and all that stuff, right? Like, these cards aren't just pack filler anymore. They might actually come up, they might actually matter, which is nice. Oh my gosh, this is a big one. Let's Konami of America be in charge. For anyone who doesn't know, the majority of Yu-Gi-Oh cards are designed in Japan by the Konami of Japan team for the Yu-Gi-Oh OCG format. It's a separate format from TCG, and we just sort of get the cards translated like 6 months later, and we have to deal with whatever they designed, right? And for a long time, this wasn't really a problem, but in recent years, particularly, it seems like Konami of America has been kind of frustrated with where the game is at, but can't really do anything because they're not in charge of of designing every card. Like, they don't like how complex the game has gotten, but again, they just kind of have to deal with it because that's what they've been given. But by creating this second format with a point system, I think they have more control over which decks are good and how good they are. And it still makes those new cards playable, just at a reduced capacity, which is also nice. This one's more important. Opens communications between Konami and players. Today they debuted the Genesys blog, where they're going to talk about, I guess, some of the goals of the format, as well as some of their decisions behind the format. Like, if they move a card on the point system, they'll probably say why. This is really important. Magic the Gathering has done this for years, not just through their official ban list, like blogs and all that stuff, but through Mark Rosewater's blog. But Konami has very rarely ever done this. There's like a famous example of like them talking about why they banned all the Plant Synchro decks when the Plant Synchro decks weren't good anymore. But the point is, this means that we're going to get a lot more information and communication between us and Konami, which is really nice. For years, it's just sort of felt like we're in this like toxic relationship where nobody talks to each other, but we're still together for some reason. So it'll be nice to at least have a one-way communication where they can tell us why things are the way they are. 8. Staples at mid-point counts. So when I heard no ban list and point system, the first thing I did was check the point list for where Pot of Greed is on the list. As well as cards like Dimension Shifter, and I think I checked Ash Blossom and a couple other things. All these cards that are considered like staples. And what I found was that most of these staple cards are at sort of mid-point counts. If the point cap for official events is 100, and Pot of Greed is at 30, that means you can run 3 Pot of Greed and still have 10 points left over. What I think the goal behind that decision is that, again, this sort of curving of power for every deck where you can place all the playmakers or all the payoffs for decks that are considered meta or like good, like all the Ryziel cards, really high, but Ryziel has to play all those cards, or they have to find ways around it, which means a Ryziel deck with, say, a really good extra deck can't afford to play 3 Pot of Greed. But a Ryziel deck with a really poor extra deck can afford to play Pot of Greed. And so that just asks the players, okay, well, what's more important? Payoffs or consistency or interruptions in the hand? What I think that does is create better balance between decks and a more complex deck building question. It's going to ask players, what do they value in building their deck, instead of just saying, I'm going to play all the monsters in the deck, and then all the hand traps that are good this format, and then all of the generic extra deck payoffs. Now you have to decide between those 3 things, or a combination of them. Number 9, this kills Pendulum. Pendulum, as a design mechanic, is something that neither players nor Konami has ever really liked. It seems like the only people who really like it are like the people who wrote the anime and a couple Pendulum Andes. I like Metal Foes, but I don't like Pendulum like as a deck or as a mechanic particularly. And it's just like an extra thing that you have to wrap your head around when you're learning the game, but has like a 0.01% chance of actually coming up in any given tournament. Like, how many Pendulum players are there in the current format when you could be playing the decks from Justice Hunters? So I'm glad they killed Pendulum, I guess. I think Pendulum, yeah, was kind of a design mistake that they've just been sort of dealing with for the last 10 years. It seems like Konami of America never really liked it. And like I said, most players didn't like it. Lapsed players definitely didn't like it. The Duelist Alliance, even though that set doesn't really have many good Pendulum cards in it, or like a really coherent Pendulum strategy, represents a boost in power creep that the game had never really seen before. And so I think that Pendulum just kind of became the poster boy for like really complex Yu-Gi-Oh formats, even though the other decks in that pack in particular were way better. More importantly, this kills Cybers. I'm going to reveal something about myself for a second. In middle school and high school, like early high school, I was really broke, but I loved Yu-Gi-Oh! And so I was trying to find a deck that would be fun to build and was cheap. The deck I ended up building was this really crappy Cybers pile, because a lot of the generic Link monsters were easy to get your hands on, like Transcode Talker and Trigate Wizard, and a lot of the extenders were really easy to get. The problem with Cybers is that is a type that was designed in a vacuum for the anime to make really cool anime moments. The majority of Cybers cards just kind of summon themselves out for free, or for doing things that the Cybers deck was already going to do. And that is really boring design space, and that bores a lot of players. But because so many of the payoffs and the triggers for getting those guys out was generic Link monsters in particular, and there are no Link monsters in the format, a lot of the Cybers decks just kind of die. Like, Joshua Schmidt talked about this in his video when he was talking about Genesys format, but the first thing he did was go and check the point list for Malice cards. But Malice is a Link deck, and there are no Links in the format, which means you don't have to play against Malice. There are a couple Cybers decks and a couple Link decks that I think are still playable. I think Salamangreat in particular is still playable. They have a Synchro monster and a Ritual monster and 2 Xyz monsters and a Fusion monster. So that extra deck, that engine is still vaguely playable, I think. Mathmech is also still playable. That deck was meant to Synchro and Xyz summon, but just because of how Cybers works, it ended up being used for a bunch of generic Link stuff. So yeah, I'm glad they killed Cybers, even though I played it for a long time, just because I think it was boring to players, and I think having just like big generic Cybers typal cards was kind of bad design-wise. I think generic typal cards should probably be used for types that have lower power. Like how the Ragnarikas boost reptile, plant, and insects, when those are types that haven't been good for a long time or have never been good. Yeah, teaching people Yu-Gi-Oh! Just got easier. Teaching people Yu-Gi-Oh! Is really hard. I've done it many times. They always forget how to play. But that's because there is an overload of information when you're teaching this game. Having taught people Magic in less than 5 minutes, I can genuinely say that the amount of mechanics you have to understand to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Is maybe too much. When you're an enfranchised player, when you're somebody who's been playing for a long time, it can be kind of hard to see the forest for the trees in that aspect. But when people can't learn your game, they can't start playing your game. And then when people can't start playing your game, the game just kind of dies, right? There are a couple like works around this. The 2-player starter set just got a lot better, I think, because there are no Link monsters in that set. But it talks about Synchro and Xyz, which is probably what's going to rule the Genesys format. But yeah, by not having to explain, like, these monsters can't go to defense position, and you have to understand how these arrows work, and by not having to explain, like, this is a spell card and a monster card at the same time sometimes, a lot of the complexity of the game just got brought down for teaching people how to play. There's just two less things that you have to teach people, right? Oh, this wasn't one of my bullet points, but now I'm gonna... Yeah, I'll talk about this at the same time. Easy integration into Master Duel, and easy product design for Konami TCG. So for Master Duel, this is really easy. You just have to take all the good decks and all the good cards. And honestly, you can probably take a similar or the same list that Konami's already done for the TCG and just give all those cards point values in the code of the game. And then you open a second duel room called Genesys or whatever, and you let people build with the point system. Konami, do that by having one format that is the same for TCG players and Master Duel players. It gets a lot easier to port Master Duel players into TCG and vice versa. I've always thought that the design goal of Konami when designing product should not be to turn people into TCG players or Master Duel players, but it should be to turn people into Yu-Gi-Oh players and get them spending money on Yu-Gi-Oh and then letting them play however they want. At the same time, this makes really easy product design for Konami of America. They can design Genesis-specific starter and structure decks. They can design Genesis-specific draft packs. They can design Genesis-specific whatever. This is great. Good job. That sort of comes with them being in charge, is now they can market the game towards the players that they're in charge of versus just like getting the OCG scraps. Okay, these next two go kind of hand in hand, but my one thing is I have complaints, or not complaints, I have concerns about this as a competitive format. They said that they were going to host tournaments. I'd be really interested to see what that looks like. The thing is, I don't know what the meta is going to look like for this format. This comes whenever you invent a casual format and then try to design a competitive environment around it. Because of the way the point system works, and because I think this makes so many more decks playable, I think it's going to be really difficult to deck build against the meta. Like, your side deck is going to be really interesting for tournaments and stuff like that. So for people who value studying and testing against the best decks and, really min-maxing their list, I could see where this might be an issue. Only time will tell. I'm not a competitive player. I don't know. If you are a competitive player, please let me know. I would be really interested to hear what your process would be like for something like this. But that dovetails into my next point, and my final point as I wrap this up. I was supposed to meet somebody for lunch relatively soon, and I've been talking for too long. This is the perfect casual format, which the game has needed for a long time. As I sort of talked about with speed duels, I think that was a good attempt, and it failed in the design stages. And at the same time, so did all the 2020 OTS formats like Deckmaster and Rivalry of Warlords and Heart of the Underdog. Like, they really tried with those, and it never really caught on for a bunch of different reasons. But this is a great way to have a not community sanctioned, a Konami sanctioned second format that is legit, that you can win things at, and gets casual people interested. I was telling my roommate about this, about how there's a second format, and how you can play 3-pot agreed, and he was like, wait, I can play 3-pot agreed? Let me look at this. And at the same time, my brother, who hasn't played Yu-Gi-Oh for a long time, I told him about this, and he was like, the first thing he thought of was pot of greed. And I was like, you can play 3-pot agreed in this format. This has me really excited. I'm definitely going to be brewing for this. I love deck building. I love teaching people to play Yu-Gi-Oh! I love playing Yu-Gi-Oh! With people. I think this is a great step forward for Konami. I would love to see them keep working at this. I don't want to see a million billion formats. I think Magic the Gathering has that problem where there's maybe too many formats, and they're all kind of cannibalizing each other at the moment. But I would love to see, like I said, somehow sanctioned domain format. Or some sort of commander variant where we can play the game in pods of 4 and it's balanced in a specific way. If that is just like Highlander rules, that's fine by me too. I don't know that it specifically needs to be domain format with a deck master and all that stuff, although that is fun. And Konami, if you're listening, if you're watching this, don't take that to mean you should just steal the rules for domain format and call it Deckmaster 2. That's not what I'm saying. You did a good thing here by taking ideas from other formats, Trinity, and I'm sure there's some Magic format that uses points. You did a good thing by taking that idea and then applying it to what makes your card game special. Do the same thing here. Take ideas from Commander and apply them to your game and figure out what makes that special. Okay, I've been talking for 30 minutes. I'm going to go. Genesys format, it's great. Goodbye.